The Cicero and Pompey relationship is a really interesting part in the collapse of the late Republic. It's pretty a highly unlikely relationship as well. Remember, Pompey's made his reputation as a general, Cicero his reputation as an orator. One of them, Pompey, a bit of a political opportunist, one point optimates, then popularis optimates again. Whereas Cicero, he's got this career-long loyalty to his concept of concordia ordinum. What happens in the build-up to, or what has happened rather, in the build-up to Pompey and Cicero creating some type of relationship or alliance? Well, remember, we've had the trial of Roscius, 80 BC, Cicero elected as quaestor in 76 BC, the whole trial of Verres stuff, and then we've got the Aedile in 69 BC and the Praetor in 66 BC. The Lex Aurelia is probably the one time where we get the earliest time when we get Cicero sort of getting aligned with Pompey. The trial of Verres really influenced the Lex Aurelia being passed, which sort of changed jury duties from the Senate to be split between the Equites and the Senate, at the same time as Pompey and Crassus were reversing all of Sulla's laws as consuls. Anyway, now where this relationship really sort of takes off is all associated with Rome's problems in the 60s BC. We've got a problem with pirates in the Mediterranean because of Verres' mismanagement in Sicily, and likewise we've got a problem in the east because of the problems with Mithridates has caused. So the big question is what's the solution? Now Pompey wanted the glory of both of these problems. Of dealing with both of these problems rather, and in order to try and get himself the commands of dealing with these, he uses, in a sort of typical popularis strategy, uses two tribunes to do that, Gabinius and Manilius. So what happens in 67 BC, Pompey via the tribune Gabinius gets the Lex Gabinia proposed in 67 BC, and what this is it's hugely controversial because it's giving Pompey a massive command for 3 years, huge imperium, despite him not even being a consul or a praetor. Cicero, we have no record of him saying anything in that whatsoever, for or against. Pompey's given 3 years to do it. He does it in 3 months. So he's back in Rome in 3 months, and obviously there's a clamour then for Pompey to deal with problem number 2, which is then proposed by the tribune Manilius. So we get the Lex Manilium in 66 BC. Similarly controversial for the same reasons as the Lex Gabinia, but this time Pompey's going to be given imperium for 5 years. But the difference is we get Cicero making the big speech, the big pro lega Manilia speech. So what's going on here? Why in 67 BC is Cicero silent, but then a year later in 66 BC, Cicero's making quite an impassioned plea for Pompey to be given the command against Mithridates? Well, what we can sort of see is that there's some type of, deal, alliance, relationship, whatever that's being made here between Cicero and Pompey. If Pompey's away from the east for 5 years, he knows he's going to need protection from political attacks that will probably come from the likely sources of Crassus and Caesar. So he needs a strong orator, someone who's got a track record of taking on bigger fish, so to speak. So Cicero fits that bill perfectly. What would Cicero get out of this? Remember, Cicero wants to become a consul, but he's always going to be sort of hamstrung by that novus homo status. So what the deal with Pompey is, it would give him mainstream supporters to help with his election to consulship. It doesn't mean that he's automatically going to become a consul, because he's still going to have to work very hard, particularly in discrediting Catiline, but it means it's a real positive step in the direction to become consul in 63 BC. So what happens with the relationship here? Pompey's gone off to the east, Cicero's staying at home. He's got to try and protect Pompey from those political attacks in the same time as becoming consul. Well, what we're going to do is we're going to measure the Pompey and the Cicero relationship on the brosometer. So at some points the relationship is going to be really positive, other times it's going to get quite sassy. So the defense of the Lex Manilia, the pro lega Manilia speech, that's definitely a step in the positive direction for Cicero and Pompey. And then once Pompey's away and Cicero's protecting him from political attacks such as the Rullan Bill, the trial of Rabirius, and Crassus's attempt to help Ptolemy in Egypt, you could say that relationship gets even more positive. If you want any details of those, remember, look at the Cicero consulship clip, and that'll go into a lot more detail on those events. Now, one of the major sort of thing of Cicero's consulship is dealing with the Catilinarian conspiracy. Now, could we say that causes a bit of a slide, a decline in the relationship? Certainly Pompey alleged to be a little bit jealous of Cicero dealing with Catiline, getting all the glory and getting that old Pater Patriae title. In addition to that, Pompey writes a letter to the Senate before he's about to return, sort of promising that his loyalties to the Republic, but makes no mention of Cicero, to which Cicero writes a little letter to Pompey that's a little bit pathetic, sort of saying that he's worked really hard for Pompey, his unremitting efforts on his behalf, and he makes that little Batman and Robin Scipio Laelius comparison, which I don't know, doesn't really work particularly for Pompey. Now, Cicero then, gets a little bit of a huff, takes a hit, because he's then opposed to what Pompey wants when he gets back. Pompey has got some pretty reasonable sort of ideas about wanting land allocated to his army and his ratification of the settlement of the East. Cicero sides with the Optimates against Pompey getting those things. So Pompey's frustrated. He's not been able to get his land for his army, his ratification of the settlement of the East. Crassus at the same time is pretty frustrated. He's not been able to get an equites rebate, and this results in something being pulled together that's called the First Triumvirate between Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus. Pompey and Crassus working together to become, let Caesar become consul in 59 BC to then sort of make laws that benefit the three of them. Cicero was asked to join but refused because of his belief in Concordia Ordinum. So that really sort of means that he could be a powerful ally for the Triumvirate in terms of his oratory and in terms of his sort of man of principle status. But if he's not going to be an ally, he can just be a pretty powerful enemy. So Caesar is going to use Claudius to get rid of Cicero. So let's go back to our bros and sassy-ometer. Already quite negative with the whole issue of Pompey's return. That continues to get negative. So Cicero refuses to join the Triumvirate, so we're going to put that down a little bit more. But then the big one is that Cicero is then exiled by Claudius with the help of Caesar. Goes to ask Pompey for help. Pompey sort of disappears out the other exit of his house, and offers absolutely no help to Cicero at all in avoiding his exile. So that's a really low point. However, interestingly, while Cicero's in exile in Greece, though, he doesn't really blame Pompey for the whole exile. He actually blames the Optimates. So can we move that up a little bit, maybe? With all the trouble that's then going on in Rome while Cicero's away, Caesar's gone to Gaul, remember? Crassus and Pompey are back to their little bitchiness. We then get a move to recall Cicero in order to help Pompey out. So Milo recalls Cicero on behalf of Pompey, so that's definitely a boost back into the positive. And then once recalled, Cicero is influential and instrumental in getting Pompey the Cura Annoni, which would boost his popularity with the plebs. So again, we're back into the positives. However, what Cicero doesn't realise is that the First Triumvirate is about to be patched together spectacularly by Caesar at two conferences, Ravenna and Lucca, to which Cicero is not invited. Despite over 200 other senators being invited, Cicero is not. It then becomes pretty apparent that the Triumvirate is patched up and Cicero has to fall back in line, and he has to, as he says, sing his palinode. What I mean by that is he's got to defend sort of allies of the Triumvirate that were his personal enemies. So Gabinius was particularly galling for him, rubbing salt into the wounds, because Gabinius had been the consul when Cicero was exiled and had refused to help him. Cicero is tasked with defending Gabinius, but hilariously and ironically, Gabinius then gets exiled himself. Cicero then takes a bit of a backseat in politics. We have the Milo-Claudius gang warfare going on, and in reaction to that, Pompey becomes sole consul in 52 BC and starts making sneaky attacks on Caesar, such as the Lex Provincia. This sort of has an impact on Cicero because it means that he's got to go to Cilicia for a year to become consul. We'll talk about that in another clip later on. But when Cicero gets back from Cilicia, it's pretty obvious that the civil war is about to begin, and Cicero is going to have to pick a side. Now, in terms of who's going to get Cicero, Cicero's quite a big player because, I don't know, to a certain extent, is he seen as sort of Rome's soul, the goody of Rome? You want him on your side so you can claim to be the goody. Pompey does write quite a short, brief letter to Cicero, but it's very, very, very flattering. He calls him general. He talks about his courage of old in the national interest, his exceptional and unceasing patriotism, and how they should work together to rescue our sorely afflicted country. To a certain extent, Cicero was always going to side with Pompey. I think you would place your bets on that side because of their past relationship. Because Pompey and Optimatus, you could argue, were closer to the Republic and Concordia Ordinum. Plus, relations with Caesar at this time are not particularly great. Cicero had tried to mediate with Caesar. He'd received a really threatening letter back. Caesar, remember, was an SCU, an enemy of the state. And in addition to that, a meeting with Caesar at a place called Formiae wasn't particularly cozy. However, so as soon as Cicero throws his hat into Pompey's camp, so to speak, or joins his team, he's writing a letter to Atticus slagging him off hilariously because Pompey has evacuated Rome. He calls it an absolute disgrace. He says that Pompey was afraid of Caesar. Pompey refused peace terms. He failed to prepare for war. He evacuated Rome. And very importantly, for as far as Cicero is concerned, he hadn't let Cicero know. Now, there's a delay in Cicero going to Pompey's camp in the Civil War because his daughter is in labour. But when he gets there, we know that Cicero, during the Civil War, during his time in Pompey's camp leading to Pharsalus, is a pretty negative guy or negative influence on the Republican side. We know this from Plutarch's Life of Cicero, who gives us some really interesting information about Cicero whilst he's in Pompey's camp. One of the few positives is that Cicero ignored Cato's advice to leave when he got there. But he stays, and he is pretty negative. He's critical of Pompey's appointments and his strategy. He generally brings sort of morale down by moping and whining all the time. He's very importantly ill at the Battle of Pharsalus, and then after Pharsalus, when Pompey's fled, Cicero, as the ex-consul, the senior politician, is offered command but refused, and that nearly leads to him getting knifed by Pompey's sons, but he's rescued at the last minute by Cato. Cicero at this point then goes to Brundisium, where he's going to try and patch up his relationship with Caesar. So in a nutshell, this relationship, to start off with, is really positive. We've got the pro-legum Manilius stuff. We've got the protection of Pompey whilst he's in the east. It starts to turn sour when Pompey returns. Is he maybe given the cold shoulder to Cicero? Cicero's exile, refusal to join the first Triumvirate. Pompey does nothing to stop it, but then he's recalled by Pompey, and we get that Cora Annoni stuff. But then we've got Cicero's Palinode, when he's pretty much humiliated and he's got to defend the Triumvirate's allies and one of his personal sort of enemies. And then the whole Civil War thing, yes, he sides with Pompey, but he's then pretty negative in Pompey's camp. So in a nutshell and in a word, how could you describe this relationship? I suppose you could say it's a really fluctuating relationship.